Chapter 2 The Little Room. A man of understanding hath lost nothing, if he yet have himself. I did not get up and walk out. I could not. But I was nevertheless in hot revolt. I hated this abnormal concentration upon the ills and defects of human life, my own and others. It offended every hard-won principle of my life. I hated the atmosphere of studied cheerfulness, the doctor marching in of a morning, a flower in his buttonhole, his face glowing ruddily after a walk in the crisp autumn air, his ready joke, his jaunty laughter. Oh, I played up to him, but I was secretly and bitterly envious, I who loved nothing in this world better than a tramp on a glorious morning. At the same time, I hated myself for the puerility of my envy. And the nurses, also glowing with health, offensively glowing, bustling, cheerful, that starched tyranny. I had afterwards a different view of nurses. One of them could whistle like a starling. But in those early days, in cheerfully condemning me to helplessness, they incited me to revolt, to scepticism, to pessimism. This, I said to myself, is not a man's world at all. It is a kind of matriarchy. This led me to think, not without a kind of humour, of a queer old book among my treasures, published not long after Shakespeare's death, called The Feminine Monarchy, a treatise on honeybees, shewing their admirable nature and properties, together with the right ordering of them from time to time. It bore a flattering dedication, I remembered, to Queen Elizabeth. Well, this was truly a feminine monarchy I lived in. Except for the distant, glowing planetary doctor, one's day was dominated from early morning until late at night by feminine autocrats. Dominated to embarrassment. A man, I maintain, does not easily submit to the indignity of being told when his hair is to be brushed, his face washed, his pyjamas changed. If ever I escape from this tyranny, I said to myself, I will consider writing a new feminine monarchy, and do it as old Charles Butler did it, out of experience. So I began studying, not without some sly amusement, which I sternly repressed, their admirable nature and properties, though I have never dared to write down my observations, since I could not be sure, even after months of experience, that I understood the right ordering of them from time to time. Miserable days they were, those earlier ones, far more difficult to bear than the pain, the weakness, even the sleepless or opiated nights that came later in the great hospital. For misery, after all, is not physical. Pain can be borne, helplessness somehow endured. Misery is always mental. Tragedy is mental. It is what we think, not what we suffer, that destroys us. It is the disturbance of ordered life, the sense of inadequacy, the conviction of failure that crushed the soul. All men, ill or well, lead frustrated lives. All of us fall short of our hopes and ideals. Human strength is never enough to meet problems and difficulties that are infinite. Human life is never long enough. We suffer because we are finite among infinite realities, because the universe is too great for us. Yes, we are all alike. We all fail. The difference between men lies in the way they face disaster, meet the tragic facts of their existence. That man is successful who has learned to live triumphantly within his limitations. I had not only never met the real problem adequately, I can see it now. I had never even faced it squarely until I reached the experience which I am here describing, when everything I loved, all I hoped for, seemed suddenly snatched away from me. In the long hours of night, when I could not sleep, sleep is often the denied anodyne of suffering. I drove my mind in a weary round of self-recrimination, probing the causes of my downfall, seeking some other than myself to blame, some chance incident of 5 or 10 or 20 years ago that might and always I came out of these weary excursions exactly where I went in, with a sense of utter futility and failure. I destroyed the present, of which I was sure, with remorse for the past, which I could not change, and apprehension of the future, which I might never know. I think of those days now with wonder and with shame. This mood of utter wretchedness continued for many days. One night, as I lay quite still but intolerably awake in my half-darkened room, I heard the sound of a man sighing or groaning, as though his very soul were in torment. I began to listen with a hushed intensity of interest. There it was again. What weariness, pain, hopeless longing. I knew nothing whatever about the patient next door. I had been too much wrapped up in my own misery even to inquire. I had heard from time to time the rumble of his voice through the wall, and occasionally a word or two as of someone speaking at his door. It came to me now with a strange sense of discovery that this was a human being, a person, suffering as I was, possibly far worse than I was. No doubt he had left friends and work and comfort he prized as much as I did. No doubt the future looked black also to him. My mind at once began conjecturing 1,000 ways the unknown life and problems of the man lying there so close to me, yet entirely unknown. What was he like? Where was he from? What was the train of events that had brought him also to this sad place? For a moment, in the sharpness of my interest, my strained listening, I forgot my own illness. There it was again, the weary sighing, a few low words that sounded like a melancholy prayer. I cannot tell how deeply it affected me. At the very moment when I was beginning to realize that I was not the only sufferer in the world, that here was a man who might be even more sadly afflicted than I, it came to me with inexpressible power and poignancy that both of us, lying there side by side, unknown to each other, were as nothing compared with the hundreds, the thousands of men and women in the hospitals of that great city, each with his own burden of suffering, each turning and twisting in the maze of his own discomforting thoughts. What a stupendous weight of illness, weakness, suffering, misery, in an entire state. I am trying to put down these thoughts just as they came upon me, tumultuously, in the dark intensity of that night. It may be that my own straining weakness accounted in part for the extraordinary sharpness and force of the impression I had. It was what I felt. I had known before, certainly, that there was an immense burden of illness and suffering in the world, but I had known it only as knowledge, not as experience, not as feeling. Sometimes in the past, when friends had been ill or sad or discouraged, I, from my haven of security, had been able to help them, or thought I helped, with assurances of strength or courage. But here was the stark reality. I was myself a part of an inconceivable sink of human misery. I could help no one else, no one could help me. For a day or so my mind struggled feverishly, if fruitlessly, with these new thoughts of the universality of human suffering. In one way I found my own situation somewhat relieved. There was a kind of comfort and satisfaction, yes, satisfaction, in knowing that I was no worse than hundreds of other men and women, and I had also a curious and recurrent sense of a new understanding, an entirely new relationship between human beings, not one based upon common enjoyment, but upon common misery. These new thoughts, however, proved no permanent abatement of my own ills. After a day or so, they seemed even to increase my weariness and hopelessness. My own chances, the chances of any individual in such a chaos of suffering, seemed even less encouraging. I was not an exception, I was the rule. I thought of all the vast paraphernalia of hospitals, medical faculties, highly trained physicians and nurses, and how impotent they were to cope with the appalling human disability that afflicted the world. Misery may love company, but company does not cure misery. In illness one is, after all, terribly alone. I will not enlarge further upon the wretchedness of those unhappy days. One morning, some 2 weeks after I lay down in that bed, I had a curious and deep inner experience. I do not know what caused it, save that I seemed to have explored every other passage in the mazes of a weary mind, but suddenly I roused up and turned fiercely upon myself. "What a ridiculous creature you are," I said, bowled over with scarcely a struggle by one of the oldest, commonest, simplest difficulties that beset human beings, even your inner fortress taken. Had I, then, lived a busy life for so many years? Had I made good friends? Had I visited strange and interesting places? Had I read many books with delight? And out of all these overflowing experiences, a life's entire accumulation, was there nothing left to carry me through a few weeks or even months in bed? Had I in reality been wholly dependent upon the external interests which had filled my hours? Had I come to such a pass that I had no resources of the spirit? Was I on such terms with myself, after long and close association, that it was hopeless misery to live alone with myself? I cannot tell with what burning urgency these questions assailed me. Though I did not stir in my bed, nor break the calm monotony with which my nurse, sitting there by the window, stitched at the bit of fancy work she held in her hand, my mind was in the fiercest turmoil. It seemed to me that I had come to the crucial test of my whole life, and at a time when I was, because of my physical weakness, least able to bear it. The nurse, looking at me, the outer shell of me, shook her head dubiously. "You have something on your mind," said she, examining the thermometer she had taken from between my lips. I said nothing. "You are disturbed," said she. "Yes," said I am disturbed. It is time that I was disturbed." "You must be quiet," said she. "Everything depends upon your being quiet." "Quiet," said I, "is what I most desire." An immense weariness came down upon me. I could not think longer or with clarity. I had been stripped bare. I had no defences left. I felt as though my life had amounted to nothing whatsoever. Opinions and beliefs upon which I had rested with oblivious content furnished no refuge in the storm. For it so often happens that when a man has reached the point where he feels that he is beginning to know how to command his life and the tools of his employment, to reap the harvest of his labour, tragedy of one sort or another touches him on the shoulder. "Can you bear it?" Or, if he winces, "Where now is your vaunted philosophy?" When the mind is deeply stirred, it seems to go on with its work in its own subterranean caverns, even when the physical husk of the body is unconscious with suffering or with sleep. Hours later, in the night, when I awakened, the tumultuous thought of the previous day, returning powerfully, presented an entirely new aspect of my situation, one that had not occurred to me before. While it was true that everything that had constituted a pleasant and satisfying life for me, my robust physical health, my habitual and interesting work, and all my books, my letters, my friends, while all these had been stripped away, I was still possessed of my own mind and my own thoughts. I had, after all, my own inner life. I had my life. In the telling, in cold words, this may seem no remarkable conclusion, still less a discovery. Of course, it was axiomatic. A child would know as much. But to me, lying there in bed, restless and miserable, it came with a wave of feeling that flooded my whole being. It was true. I had in reality, however helpless, vast inner possessions upon which I had not counted. Of all that I really was, I had so much left. A couplet that had long lain concealed in my memory came to me with fresh significance. Still to ourselves in every place consigned, our own felicity we make or find. It was true. It was true. I was consigned to myself here in this gabled room, after the manner of all prisoners, all sick men, all those fortunately banished or outcast. I was condemned to enforced quiet, to an utter vacuity of outward possessions and ordinary interests. I was consigned to myself, and no one but myself could make or find my felicity. No doctor, however cunning, no nurse, however skilful, no prophet or preacher or book, not riches, not friends. It was only this strange something that was within me that could find me peace or comfort. Yes, words are poor things. They express inadequately the power and the beauty of thoughts which shake or mould our lives. This was the beginning. It is with the tests and explorations of this idea coming so powerfully into my mind that I shall now write, basing what I have to say upon notes that I soon began to scrawl, a few a day, as I was able, in a little book I kept in the drawer of the desk that stood near the head of my bed.